Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Marijuana in the Workplace, 5 Things to Know, brought to you by Current Consulting Group and sponsored by Recovery Track. We'd like to introduce you to today's presenters, Kirk Caesarly from Recovery Track. Kirk is the Chief Executive Officer at Recovery Track, and he brings over 20 years of experience in proven excellence in information technology and technical management. He has an extensive experience serving the federal, state, local governments, and healthcare industries. And we also have with us today Bill Current, who is the president of the Current Consulting Group and the author of Why Drug Testing Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books on substance abuse related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized brand name in compliance, business development, and operation consulting in the drug testing industry. As we begin today's presentation, we wanted to share with you a short video clip. Thus, if you have questions for Kirk about Recovery Track and about Proof, please feel free to reach out to him. We'll send you contact information at the end of the presentation, but also it's on this slide, their website as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Bill Current at this time to get us started on the webinar presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. And I just want to say, I want to thank Recovery Track Proof and Kirk for sponsoring today's webinar presentation. Kirk, is there anything you want to add about your video before I launch into my presentation?
I think it would, as you saw in the video, the concept and the rollout of the Proof solution is to be able to do remote observed drug and alcohol testing, which essentially means you can do your testing at the point of where your donors are, whether that's in an office, at home, on travel, in a hotel. So we eliminate the issues and the problems with sending folks to collection sites. And it's very accurate, very safe, very user-friendly, and makes what has been a difficult process in the past really easy and seamless. So I think that'd be enough for now, Bill, and I appreciate it. And thank you for letting me be a part of the webinar today. And I look forward to your presentation, as I know everyone else who's attending is too.
Well, thank you, Kirk. We offer these webinars free of charge to our attendees, and we love doing them. We don't charge for the CEU credits either. So a sponsorship like the one that Proof is providing today is really helpful to us, and so we appreciate that very much. I do want to say this about telehealth or video or remote observed collections. They started picking up steam and interest as a result of COVID, I think. We did a survey last year. As many of you know, the Current Consulting Group does 2 surveys every year. The drug testing industry survey, we just released the results of it at the NDASA conference. It was our 24th annual survey. And then this year we'll do our 6th annual employer survey. And last year we asked employers what level of interest they had in telehealth collections. Have you heard of it? Are you using it? Do you have any plans to use it? And it was kind of interesting because it was a fairly small percentage, maybe 5%, that said they had started using telehealth or remote observed collections. But about 12% said they were interested in knowing more about it and that they were considering using it. So about 17% total. And I thought to myself, 3 years ago, the percentage would have been 0. And so I think it's something that's catching on. I'm going to share my predictions for the future of drug testing at the end of today's presentation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about where I think that fits in. The hot issue in the drug testing industry and the drug testing world right now continues to be marijuana. So we're going to talk about 5 things every employer, every drug testing provider should know about marijuana right now. If I don't cover something that you'd like to talk about, put a question in the chat section, or let us know afterwards. If you have a question I don't have an answer for right in front of me, we'll research it, we'll look it up for you, we'll send you an email or get on the phone with you, whatever you prefer, and answer your question for you. But anything that you would like to talk about relative to today's topic or just drug testing in general. And the other big topic in the industry is oral fluid testing because of the notice of proposed rulemaking from the Department of Transportation. So I've got a couple of slides coming up on on oral fluid testing as well as it relates to testing for marijuana. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about sort of the current state of marijuana use in the country. Is it increasing? What impact, if any, is it having on the workplace? Is it still legal to test for marijuana in all the states? Are there any problems in certain states? And really the big bugaboo issue when it comes to marijuana is marijuana impairment. How long does it really last? There's a lot of information out there, but a very definitive study came out last year from the University of Sydney, which I'll talk about, that I think sets the record straight and contradicts what a lot of the pro-marijuana people are saying about marijuana impairment. And then we'll look at the different government-approved drug testing methods and how they work when it comes to detecting marijuana. So as I go through the slides, be thinking of your questions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'll even bring Kirk back in at the end if there's specific questions you'd like to ask about telehealth collections as well. So let's talk about, is marijuana use increasing? Well, the answer is absolutely. It's going up. Now, every year, the federal government, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, puts out a report. It's really the results of a survey that they do, where they ask Americans about their drug use behavior, their drug use activities. And you can see here that the level of marijuana use that was self-reported increased from 17.5% in 2019 to 17.9% in 2020, as reflected in the latest report available, which was from 2021. The results are always a year behind. So the 2021 report shows the increase from 2019 to 2020. I think when the 2022 report comes out that shows 2021, the increase will be even higher. But look at the increase from 17.5% of people in the survey admitting that they were regular users of marijuana to 17.9%. Out of tens of millions, a 0.4% increase is considered statistically significant. Now, if you look over at psychotherapeutic drugs like the antidepressants and those kinds of prescription drugs, you can see that there was a decrease from 5.9 to 5.8, but a much smaller sampling, 16 million versus nearly 50 million. So maybe not as statistically significant of a decrease. And again, I'm going to make a prediction that when the 2022 report comes out from the federal government, we'll see that number probably going up, because there are indicators that certain drugs besides marijuana are increasing in usage, like opioids and synthetic opioids, where we've seen a dramatic increase in the overdose and overdose mortality rates with opioid usage. So I think we're going to see this number start to go up. And I realize it's not apples to apples. You got heroin right, way down there on the bottom, but drug abuse generally is going up, marijuana use going up significantly. And so what does that mean going forward? Well, so look, I'm going to focus on three things. Marijuana use is up, the fear of harm is down, and first-time users are in the millions. So look to the right there, you'll see marijuana use among adults 26 and older, so not counting the teenagers, but 26 and older increased from 7% in 2002 to nearly 20% in 2020. That's a dramatic increase. After years of going down and years of sort of leveling off, we saw a dramatic increase in marijuana use between 2002 and 2020 that coincides directly with the legalization of marijuana. Second point, perceived risk of harm. This is a question that's asked as part of that government survey. Do you perceive a risk of harm in using or smoking marijuana on a weekly basis? You can see it's declined actually from 36.3% in 2015 to 27.4% in 2020. So just in a 5-year period, it declined almost 10%. That's a huge drop in that particular category. So more people using marijuana, fewer people seeing any harm in using marijuana on a weekly regular basis. And then among people 12 and older, 2.8 million people used marijuana for the first time in 2020. So that again shows us that marijuana is really sort of at the heart of the increase in substance abuse in the United States, and probably no end in sight to that trend at the present time as states continue to legalize marijuana and to make it somewhat more challenging for employers to address the problem. And it's having a direct impact on the workplace. So I put a bunch of stuff just on one slide here. So let me kind of go through it and unpack this one bullet point at a time. So every year, Quest Diagnostics, the #1 brand in drug testing and among the laboratories certainly, but the #1 brand recognized in our annual industry survey, puts out a report every year called the Drug Testing Index, DTI. It's a great report. It's been coming out for decades now. Point #1, positivity rates for marijuana in the general U.S. workforce. So they divide their results by the general U.S. workforce and mandated or DOT drug testing. So in the general U.S. workforce, based on more than 6 million urine tests, so this wasn't counting the oral fluid tests and the hair tests that they do through Quest Laboratories, continued an upward climb, increasing 8.3% from 3.6 in 2020 to 3.9 in 2021. Look at that second bullet. That's the highest positivity rate ever reported for marijuana in the DTI. So an upward climb and surpassing any levels from the past. Over 5 years, positivity for marijuana in the general U.S. workforce increased 50%, 2.6 to 3.9 between 2017 and 2021. I'm working my way to the last bullet here. Marijuana positivity particularly surged in states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana, 118.2% between 2012 and 2020. The vast majority of the increase in marijuana use throughout the country are in those, handful of states that have legalized marijuana for recreational, or what some people call adult use of marijuana. California, Oregon, Colorado, Washington, New York, New Jersey. Those are among the states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana as opposed to medicinal marijuana laws. So of the 39 states that have legalized marijuana either for recreational or medicinal purposes, the majority of the increase in marijuana use that are positivities, positive results, are coming from those states that have legalized recreational marijuana. Now to the final bullet. The overall positivity rate in the combined U.S. workforce, based on nearly 9 million urine drug tests. So the combined U.S. workforce is all the non-mandated and the DOT mandated drug tests. So over 9 million urine tests, again, not counting the oral fluid and the hair tests that Quest does, collected between January and December of 2021, was up in 2021 to 4.6% compared to 4.4% in 2020. But look at that in orange, up 31.4% from an all-time low of 3.5% just 10 years ago. So just 10 years ago, basically 10 years ago, the positivity rate was at its lowest point ever. And in about a 10-year period of time, it's increased 31.4%. So what's the impact on the workplace? Well, a lot more employees are coming to work with marijuana in their system. We're going to talk about impairment here in a second. But as part of our survey in 2021, we asked employers, if you were considering removing marijuana, why would you do that if you're going to not test for marijuana? And as you can see there, look at the second one. We are concerned about lawsuits and legal liability if we test for marijuana. And then the next one, that was 41.6%. So a huge chunk of employers are concerned about getting sued by discontented job applicants or employees if that employer tests for marijuana. Look at the next one. Testing for marijuana is not permitted in our state or states where we have business operations, 12.5%. That's just a misunderstanding or the result of some bad news that's out there, because testing for marijuana is legal and permitted in every state, even New York, which I'm going to explain in a minute. And the last one, nearly 30%, we cannot hire new employees due to marijuana positive drug tests. So a lot of companies really struggling in this tight hiring market to find people they can hire if they base one of the requirements passing a drug test. And the test that people are, the drug for which people test positive most often is marijuana. So I present this information to you. It's from last year's survey. We're getting ready to do the annual employer survey here in a couple of weeks, but a lot of employers are concerned about their legal right to test for marijuana or the fear of being sued if they test for marijuana, or if they act on a positive drug test result for marijuana. And that's a problem, because in the end result is that many employers may choose not to test for marijuana and then face some unintended consequences, like perhaps having a worker high on marijuana while on the job harm another person. That employer will be held responsible for the actions and the behavior of that employee who was perhaps high on marijuana while driving a delivery van or operating a forklift, etc. The employer doesn't give up that responsibility, that liability, just because the drug is legal in their state. So now let me say this. I should have said this at the very beginning. I believe in drug testing, and I think testing for marijuana is still a smart business decision. So, you know, I'm biased in how I present this information, of course, and maybe you would expect that from me. I will say that I gave a presentation in a West Coast state. I won't say which one, so I don't want to incriminate anybody, but it was a West Coast state that with a name that started with O. And I was giving a presentation to a group of HR executives and managers. And I give about, you know, anywhere from 50 to 60 presentations a year. I you know, sometimes I'm doing 2 or 3 presentations a week, and 6, 7, 8 a month. And I give a lot of presentations, and I usually get good marks. And I'm not soliciting good marks from you, but I got some negative marks that day in that HR presentation that I did. And their biggest complaint was that I seemed to be pro drug testing. And so I have to admit it. I've been in the business for 32 years. I've been doing this a long time, and I believe drug testing works. And I think drug testing for marijuana is still a smart business decision, despite some of the challenges that come along with it. And one of them is sort of overcoming this misconception or misunderstanding that it's not legal to test for marijuana. So here's the map of the country that shows the states that have legalized marijuana. And my advice to you is, don't be intimidated by the map. The orange states are the states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use. The blue states are the states that have legalized marijuana for medicinal use, and all of the orange states have already approved it for medicinal use. So you could count those blue also. The white states are the ones that haven't legalized marijuana yet. Now, as you look at this, many of you on the call today, I'm sure, are multi-state employers or drug testing providers who work all over the country. And so this map is important to you. And it's important to note that even though marijuana may be legal in Colorado, drug testing is legal in Colorado also. And drug testing for marijuana is still legal in Colorado. There are some states that make it a little bit more challenging, but it's not against the law. It's not somehow prohibited. There may be a restriction on what an employer can do with a positive drug test result. It doesn't mean that you can't act on a positive result for marijuana in Illinois, for example. You just have to show a connection between the positive drug test result and some evidence of impairment. So one of the things I always tell employers is keep track of the things, the actions, the behaviors that trigger a drug test. And then if you do get a positive, it's just one piece of the overall justification you have for taking adverse employment action. Excessive tardiness, confrontations in the workplace, stealing from the company, you know, not showing up. All of those things combined with a possible positive drug test for marijuana justify an employer's right to do something about that individual. You're not making the determination based solely on the drug test result in Illinois. You're combining it with other factors that under any other circumstances would justify terminating employment or putting an employee on notice. So the good news is, yes, you can test for marijuana in every state. Now, there are some real tight restrictions in New York. New York, basically, we would say, has prohibited testing for marijuana. There is some wiggle room in reasonable suspicion or post-accident scenarios that meet a specific definition given by the state. But generally speaking, employers probably shouldn't plan to test for marijuana as sort of a random test or a pre-employment test. If you are mandated under the DOT regulations to drug test, you must test for marijuana, and no state law would interfere with your right and your ability to do that, okay? There are a number of state marijuana laws that specifically prohibit employers from discriminating against legal users of marijuana. Typically, a legal user is a registered medical marijuana user. That would be proof of legal use of marijuana, okay? But even in those states, again, using Illinois as an example, individuals may not use marijuana at work or be under the influence of marijuana while at work. You still have the legal right to prohibit employees from bringing pot into the workplace, using it while on the job, or being impaired or under the influence of marijuana while they're working in all 50 states, even in New York. So that's important to understand, because when it comes to marijuana, you still have plenty of rights to regulate and to restrict some things that are related to using marijuana. So remember, in all 50 states, employers still have the right to prohibit employees from using marijuana on the job, bringing marijuana into the workplace, or being at work impaired or under the influence of marijuana. And if you're under if you're a DOT covered employer or you're working with DOT covered employers, you still must test for marijuana. I spoke to Patrice Kelly. A lot of us heard her talk at the NDASA conference. I don't think that's going to change. I think even if Congress somehow decriminalized marijuana or even legalized marijuana nationally, which I don't see happening in the near future, the DOT would still require covered employers to test for marijuana. So that part's not going to change. The real issue outside of a federal mandate to test for marijuana, like the DOT regulations, and the real hot issue within this hot issue of marijuana is impairment. How long does marijuana impairment really last? You can do a Google search and you'll find a lot of information, and it'll be very interesting. You may read some stuff that really scares you about your right as an employer to deal with marijuana in the workplace. I would advise you to keep reading, because there's some very good unbiased information out there on the marijuana issue, and particularly on the issue of marijuana impairment and how long it lasts. Before I launch into this, let me just dissuade you of one concept that's out there. You hear people talking about the peak window of impairment, that at about 20 minutes, a person reaches the peak moment of impairment for marijuana. And then after that, they're either not really impaired, or as an employer, it's not really any of your business to know if they have marijuana in their system. And that's just a false teaching that's out there. There is no such thing as a peak window of impairment, because there are a lot of factors that go into determining if somebody is either cognitively or through their psychomotor abilities impaired. There are a lot of things that can cause impairment, and a lot of reasons for impairment, like sleep deprivation. Maybe you're a new mother or new father and you're not getting a full night's sleep. Well, I remember those days. That's something that can cause impairment. It's not drug-related impairment, but I may be somehow impaired at work the next day because of a lack of sleep. When it comes to drug use and marijuana use in particular, there are a number of factors that go into determining or deciding that somebody's impaired, or if somebody becomes impaired. And it's different from person to person. So the individual's drug use history, the frequency of use. So is this somebody who's been smoking pot for a long time? Is this someone who uses marijuana every day? How do they use the drug? Are they smoking? Are they vaping? Are they using edibles? And then, very importantly, the level of THC in the cannabis that they're actually using. So back in the 70s, when I was in high school, the typical THC content level for marijuana was probably 3 or 4. Nowadays, there are strains of marijuana that are 20, 25, 30% THC. They're very high levels of THC that are going to have a greater impact on the impairment level of an individual than the relatively impotent THC of the 70s and 80s. And then also a factor is what's being asked of that individual. What task are they performing? All of these things combined determine impairment. So for somebody to generally say that there's a peak window of impairment that applies universally to all users is misleading, because a person is impaired or their impairment is influenced by lots of different factors. And I was interested, so I got this off the internet today. This only goes through 2016, but it shows the gradual but steady and ultimately dramatic increase in THC levels. Now, THC is tetrahydrocannabinol. It's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. And so depending on how the drug is used, it will determine, how much THC actually is there. The THC level in a marijuana plant is not dormant, but it's relatively low, very low. But once heat is applied, either by vaping or by smoking or by baking the THC into a batch of brownies or something, that heat process sort of ignites, if you will, and that's not the scientific way, that's just my way of saying it, the THC content, and that's when it becomes more THC potent. So you can see that the THC concentration has gone up significantly, and as the verbiage says there, boutique growers are now producing strains that top 30%. So those are all things that come into consideration when talking about the issue of impairment. Now, you're gonna get these charts, you're gonna be able to see them, so or these slides, so you don't have to write all this down, but here's a chart that compares the window of effect of possible impairment for all the major drugs of abuse. There are other drugs of abuse, of course, and there are subcategories in all of these areas, but you can see the first one is cannabis, THC, 10 minutes to 10 hours with residual effects in specific behaviors up to 24 hours, like somebody who's performing complex divided attention tasks, like operating a forklift, where you have to both cognitively and by way of psychomotor ability operate that forklift. And so depending on the type of task that's being performed, there may be a sort of a lingering effect of the impairment versus somebody who's sitting at a desk looking at a computer. Now, I say all of that, and you can see the other drugs and where they come into effect as well. But there was a study that came out from the University of Sydney in Australia that looked at 80 different studies on impairment. So this was not a single study on impairment. It was a report that analyzed the results of 80 different studies on impairment from all over the world. And they came to the conclusion that marijuana impairment lasts from 3 to 10 hours. Again, depending on a lot of the factors like I showed you in that previous slide right there, lasts from 3 to 10 hours. And so to claim that there's a peak window of impairment, that somebody at the 20-minute mark is more impaired than somebody at the 8-hour mark, is misleading in the sense that depending on what's being asked of that individual, the impairment may be just as dangerous at the 8-hour mark as it is at the 20-minute mark. So there's no such thing as a peak window of impairment when it comes to looking at safety in the workplace. Now, there are various drug testing methods, and each method has its own window of detection, not window of impairment, but window of detection. So if you look to the far left, you see breath, blood, and oral fluid right there on the far left. Those are methods. Now, breath doesn't really exist yet, but for drug testing, but those are methods that would show the parent drug, the drug itself, meaning that you would be able to detect that drug in a blood sample or an oral fluid sample, for example, within minutes after usage. Whereas you can see the urine line is just a little over to the right of the left vertical line, indicating that there's a lag time before a drug becomes detectable in a urine sample. And the reason for that is in urine, you're detecting a metabolite of a drug. So it takes a few hours, 6, 7, 8 hours, before a drug becomes a metabolite or it's detectable as a metabolite. Whereas with oral fluid and blood, you're actually able to detect the parent drug or the drug itself and not just the metabolite, which takes hours to become detectable. Now, if you look to the far right, you'll see hair. Hair is going to take several days before a drug becomes detectable in a hair sample, but the window of detection extends far longer than urine, oral fluid, and blood, up to about 90 days at the cutoff levels that are typically used right now. But oral fluid is right there on the left as a recent use detection method. Urine, a little bit of a lag time, but a farther out window of detection compared to oral fluid. Now, let's look at that juxtaposed with the window of impairment. You can see that breath, when it comes into existence, will have a window of detection of about 2 to 3 hours. And urine won't start for about 6-7 hours. So, there's a lag time before the drug becomes detectable there. But in oral fluid, the drug is detectable immediately after usage for beyond the 10 hours, but for the entire window of impairment of 3 to 10 hours for cannabis, for marijuana. So the only drug testing method that's capable of covering that entire window of impairment of 3 to 10 hours is oral fluid. Doesn't mean you have to use oral fluid, but it's the one method that's capable of detecting use right after somebody has used a drug through the entire 3 to 10 hour window of detection or window of impairment as identified by the University of Sydney report. Now, understanding the window of impairment and the window of detection is important because it can help you as an employer choose the drug testing method that's best for you. You wouldn't want to test with a method that has a too short of a window of detection because you're going to miss 70-80% of the positives for marijuana that you would capture with oral fluid or with blood. Blood, considered by the smartest people in our industry, people like Donna Smith and others, would probably consider blood to be the gold standard scientifically, but perhaps not reasonable and actually not even allowed in some states for workplace drug testing purposes. So you're really looking at oral fluid as that one method that can detect marijuana throughout the entire 3 to 10 hour window of impairment. If that's important to you, then look into doing oral fluid testing. If it's not important to you, if you're looking more for lifestyle, then you're probably going to want to look at urine. There's going to be that lag time after usage, but if this is a regular user, they're going to have the drug in their system anyway, and you're going to get a positive result from that individual for about 3 to 4 days. Now, there are those, and you'll see this on the internet, there are those who claim that somebody can test positive for marijuana weeks later. And that's true. But at the cutoff levels that are mandated by DOT and observed by virtually every state in its drug testing laws, you're not going to get positive results for somebody 3 weeks later. At the cutoff levels that we're talking about, you're really only going to have a window of detection of about 3 to 4 days. A lot less than that for oral fluid testing and blood, much longer for hair. And if you're looking at lifestyle, you're really looking for urine testing or hair testing. DOT still requires a urine lab-based urine test, but there are other government-approved testing methods that are very good at detecting marijuana that may fit into your program. For example, you look at this chart, you look at the 5 major drug testing methods. There's lab-based urine testing, and then on-site or post point of collection, point of care, instant result testing devices with urine. There's hair testing, which is always a lab-based test. Then there's lab-based oral fluid testing and point of collection oral fluid testing, the instant disposable devices. Now, the only 3 methods that have been endorsed by the federal government, by SAMHSA, are of course lab-based urine testing, which has been endorsed by SAMHSA since the beginning of time, so to speak, and lab-based oral fluid testing, because in October of 2019, SAMHSA came out with final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing within the federal government. So not government mandated of private sector employers, but of federal government agencies. In February 28th of this year, the US Department of Transportation issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that would allow the use of lab-based oral fluid testing in compliance with the DOT regulations. In 2020, this sort of got sidelined by the pandemic, of course, but in 2020, SAMHSA put out a notice of proposed rulemaking for hair testing. So it has quasi endorsement from the federal government, although far from being final or official. But lab-based oral fluid testing, absolutely. Final guidelines are out there. They're part of 49 CFR Part 40. And DOT has come out with a notice of proposed rulemaking, signaling to the world that they intend to make lab-based oral fluid testing permissible under the DOT regulations. So when you compare these three testing methods, of course, urine testing is still the #1 method. It's right now, for the time being, it's the only method permitted under the DOT regulations, but it's been around forever and is legal in every state. Lab-based oral fluid testing, as I mentioned, endorsed by SAMHSA in 2019, the notice of proposed rulemaking this year, February 28th from DOT, but it's the only government-approved drug testing method capable of detecting recent use. Remember, with urine, you've got that lag time of 6, 7, 8 hours. With oral fluid, you're able to detect the parent drug, which makes it possible to detect drug use within minutes after somebody's used the drug. And even prior to these regulations, on a state-by-state basis, lab-based oral fluid testing was already legal in 47 states, Vermont, Maine, and Hawaii being the 3 exceptions. I do believe now with these federal guidelines in place and with DOT essentially signaling its intention to allow lab-based oral fluid testing, we'll see all 3 of those states allow lab-based oral fluid testing. Hair testing, legal in most states. We've got the NPRM from SAMHSA from 2020. It's a longer road ahead for hair testing, but it's a valid testing method. And all 3 of these testing methods are capable of detecting marijuana. So here's a chart that sort of summarizes everything I said about the window of detection, the ability to detect recent drug use, the legality by state. So I'll leave this with you. You can look at it. I think the other thing that you want to take a look at is, whether or not you can detect alcohol in that method as well. So the answer is yes for urine, yes for oral fluid, yes, sort of with hair, but not typically. And yes for blood, of course, but not practical for workplace circumstances. So, but here again, marijuana is not the only drug of abuse. We're seeing increases in other methods or other drugs. And so you want a drug testing method that can test for more than just marijuana. That would be silly to just use a marijuana only type of test, because we're seeing dramatic increases in amphetamine usage and opioid uses in particular. So I think oral fluid's a good bet. Now, I'm going to make some predictions towards the end, but let me just sort of give you a little teaser to that, which is I think oral fluid's going to be one of the main testing methods going forward. I've been tracking this for years, especially through the Current Consulting Group annual survey. At the NDASA conference, we released the results, and one of the questions that we asked, that we talked about at the conference, was in the future, which drug testing method will be used the most? And just over 50%, like 50.3 or 4% said urine, and 42.6% said oral fluid. So that's an amazing development and paradigm shift that's occurring in the drug testing industry, because if I had asked that question 10 years ago, it would have been 100% urine and 0% oral fluid, or some really lopsided result like that. And in 2022, the result was almost 50-50. That shows a dramatic movement toward oral fluid testing within the drug testing industry for all of the reasons that you see there on the chart in front of you. In 2021, 73% of drug testing providers offered oral fluid testing, not the other question I asked. That's up from 63% in 2020 and 37% in 2019. The DOT notice of proposed rulemaking, and when it becomes final, when those final guidelines come out, I think we'll have a dramatic increase. You'll see far more providers, but this has really been a long, sort of slow process for the drug testing industry to really sort of accept and embrace oral fluid testing. But we're seeing that in our drug testing survey bears that out. Now, one more thought. So my advice to employers, and one of the things that we do at the Current Consulting Group is we write drug testing policies. That's part of our core service of the company. And so I always tell companies, have a policy, of course, but be clear when it comes to marijuana use. Let it be known in your policy, communicate it to your employees that marijuana use in the workplace or while on the job, even if you're out, at a work site somewhere else, will not be tolerated. And be clear about that. Employees may not be impaired by marijuana while on the job. Comply with the laws, of course, that apply to you. Don't discriminate, but depending on the actual laws that apply to you and which state law applies to you, if you're in multiple states, all of them, okay, that's a different webinar. Applicants who test positive may not be hired. Now, again, it depends on the law, okay, the state that you're in. But under most circumstances, you can refuse to hire somebody who tests positive for marijuana on a pre-employment test. But don't let legal marijuana scare you away from drug testing and testing for marijuana, because you have some exposure to legal liability if you don't test for marijuana, if you can't show that you're making a good faith effort to keep marijuana out of your workplaces, okay? So again, as I said before, in every single state, you still have the right to prohibit employees from coming to work under the influence, bringing marijuana into the workplace, or using marijuana while on the job, because you hired them to do something else besides being stoned on the job. So be clear about those things. I do want to make one point. I've sort of alluded to this in other parts, but there's two doctrines of law that apply into this situation directly: negligent hiring and respondent superior, which is sometimes called negligent retention. But this is when you should have known, you should have made a good faith effort to make sure that that your employees were drug-free, and you didn't. You weren't doing pre-employment testing, or you weren't including marijuana in your drug test panel, and then heaven forbid something happened, something horrible, and you know the person who was injured or harmed, or the property damage that occurred, they're coming back looking for justice, and they may sue the employee who caused the accident, but they're most likely going to sue the employer based on negligent hiring or negligent retention or respondent superior. And there are a number of cases that bear this out, lots of case law. This is just one from Kentucky. I won't go into a lot of detail on this. This actually involved an alcoholic who was hired, and the company really sort of didn't do anything to deter alcohol abuse among their workers, and didn't even test this individual for a few hours after this unfortunate accident occurred. And the court ordered the company to pay almost $5 million in compensatory and punitive damages. That's enough money to put most small businesses out of business. So you have a responsibility to yourself, to your employees, maybe to your shareholders, etc., to make a good faith effort to address drugs in the workplace, marijuana in particular, and not to be intimidated by the cultural trend or the map that shows marijuana legalization spreading throughout the country, because in virtually every state, employers still have the right to test for marijuana. There may be conditions, there are in many states, conditions that you have to comply with, but you're able to test for marijuana virtually everywhere without limitations. And even in New York, where I would say testing for marijuana is prohibited, you can still test for marijuana under some very, very limited circumstances. So before we open it up to Q&A, I just want to bring Kirk back in for a second, because I think that there's a connection between this technology of being able to do remote observed collections and the marijuana situation. I'm not saying directly, Kirk, but one of the things I noticed in your literature is that a lot of your testing, which can be done with lots of different methods, is oral fluid based. And of course, I just spent a lot of time talking about that in light of the marijuana situation. How would you address an issue where somebody says, well, you know, I'm thinking about doing telehealth or video observed, remote observed collections. How's that going to factor in? Is that legal in the states where I do business? How would you respond to that, Kurt?
Yes, I would say, as you answered also earlier, that it would be. And the biggest difference, as we noted earlier, rather than having your donors visit a collection site and taking time away from work, the performance during the day, or if you are using drug testing in your pre-employment hiring, then it would help your prospects in terms of not having to visit a collection site, but have their collection materials delivered in tamper-sealed packaging safely, securely to their home, to their current office where they may be, or if they are on travel. It would mean that they would be much more convenient in terms of being able to get the collection done faster, quicker, and ultimately safer, as many of the collection sites are really focused on health and not so much these days on drug testing. So it'd be more convenient, safer, and ultimately more secure. So as employers are questioning just their drug testing policies in general, or getting this done with the marijuana laws making it a little bit more difficult, this really would allow them to facilitate their testing much easier than ever before, actually. And I don't see the collection sites really changing much. They are limiting hours of operations. We see that happen every day. They are shutting down locations where they were convenient before, so they're less and less available to the employers and to their donors. So it opens up just a lot more opportunities to be able to get those tests done and help mitigate the risks that go along without doing these. So I think it's a huge solution that adds a lot of benefits.
Now, and let me tell our attendees that Kirk was very concerned. He didn't want his participation to come across as commercial or a sales pitch. So I appreciate that, Kirk. But a lot of people may not know how a telehealth collection or remote observed collection works. So I did include a slide. Maybe this can be the last slide on this topic, but can you kind of walk us through the sort of how it works process?
Sure, absolutely. You know, we do work with employers directly to help them do their testing, and make it very simple for them to order tests and see their outcomes, their results as they occur. We also work with drug testing providers, i.e. third-party administrators, TPAs, to allow them to provide this platform to their customers directly. Essentially, you know, once you create an account with the Proof platform, the employer or the TPA has access to an ordering portal of which they can process or request orders for individuals that need to be tested. It can be one test at a time, it can be multiple. So if there are frequent testing requirements for individuals, that's all very easily done. When an individual order is created for a donor, they will receive an account, a set of credentials that are emailed or texted to them directly. And at the same time that occurs, the Proof pack or the kits, the actual collection devices, are shipped directly to the donor, and or they can be shipped in bulk to a TPA or to an employer and then handed out to the donors as testing is needed. When it's time to test, either for a pre-employment, trying to hire somebody very quickly, which means really with Proof, no scheduling, so you can get your test and collections done almost immediately. Or if it's through a random program, when notifying the donor, they will download the mobile Proof app to their smartphone, the donor will. They'll start their collection at whatever time of day is convenient to them, anytime during the week. It's essentially open 24/7, all 365 days out of the year. And it takes about 15 minutes for the app to guide the individual through all of the steps that are necessary to do their self-collection. And in this example, we're talking a lot about oral fluid, which is our #1 specimen type in Proof. While it's instructing them, it's recording them and video observing them doing this each step from start to finish, even including a step that verifies their identity through scanning government IDs and doing facial recognition scans, so we can confirm on screen who is the donor that we're intending to receive the specimen from and get the test results for. Once that collection is complete, as I mentioned, it's about 15 minutes or less. Some folks can do it in about 10 minutes, so it's very fast. And about 1/10 of the time it takes to go to a collection facility to complete the entire process. Once it's done, the specimen is handed over to a carrier, overnight carrier to the laboratory. All these materials are included in the collection pack, and the app guides the individual on how to do all of the packaging safely and securely. And in 1 to 2 days, the individual testing entity, either the TPA or the employer directly, would get their results, just like they're used to getting those today. So they get them in a lab report format, but they do get something additional, and that's all the Proof materials, the assets collected during the collection, which you would not get from a brick and mortar facility. You get a collection report certifying everything occurred properly, or if it didn't, you know exactly what happened, so you can make a good business decision on what to do next. So pretty straightforward, pretty fast, and very open and convenient for all sorts of individuals. Like I said, either channel partners, TPAs, or directly to employers.
Thank you, Kurt. Now, audience, I did promise that I would share my predictions for the future, but there were a couple of questions that we wanted to answer today. So Jessica, could you just share those 2 questions that we talked about so that we can answer them today? And then I'll leave this up. These are my predictions for the future of drug testing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Kirk. First question that we had from the audience, and we appreciate the questions being sent in. Our purpose in these webinars is to help bring you information. And so when you have questions, that helps us to get you the information you want. So please feel free to send any questions in. If we don't get to the question during the live presentation, then we will reach out to you after the webinar to make sure that those questions are answered. So this question comes from Minnesota, I believe. So if an employee is doing a new hire drug test and is on medical marijuana and tests positive on the pre-employment test, where does an employer stand on this one?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say that I really highly recommend confirmation testing under all circumstances. So if this was a rapid result test and it came back non-negative, send it to the lab to be confirmed. I also strongly believe, and I've got an article coming up on this in one of our newsletters, on the role of the medical review officer to verify the lab result, the collection process, and everything. And so typically in some states, now I'd have to go back and look at Minnesota in particular, but I believe Illinois is an example of this. The individual would be able to use their status as a registered medical marijuana user as a justification for testing positive. It doesn't mean that the same would apply in a, say, reasonable suspicion or post-accident scenario. That would be different. But there are some states that have made marijuana legal where they've included in their marijuana law language that applies to what we would call pre-employment drug testing, and that prohibits an employer from refusing to hire an individual based solely on the fact that they're a medical marijuana user. Nevada is an example of that, where there would be that specific restriction. So the answer to your question is sort of on a state-by-state basis, but I would confirm a non-negative result. I would have an MRO verify the result, and then based on the state law that applies to you, I'd be aware that there may be some states like Nevada where you cannot refuse to hire somebody based solely on the fact that they're a medical marijuana user.
Great, thank you so much for that information, Bill. And so then this has kind of been brought up earlier in the presentation and a little bit now, but for clarification, would the question ask, are you only recommending reasonable suspicion testing, not recommending rapid or random testing across the board?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that. Again, it depends on the state and what the legal restrictions may be. But no, I apologize if I said something that maybe could be construed that way. I still believe random testing is the testing method with the strongest deterrent. So when people ask me what's the most effective post-accident or testing method to prevent accidents in the workplace, my answer is usually random drug testing, because it deters use, whereas a post-accident test occurs after the accident's already taken place. So I apologize if I said anything that came across that way. That's not what I'm recommending.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for that clarification. And so this actually brings us to the end of our question section. And so we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's presentation. And we again would like to thank Recovery Track for sponsoring today's webinar presentation, and thank Bill for sharing with us his knowledge in this area of marijuana in the workplace. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you and have a nice day.